Hello and welcome back to the channel. We talk horror here. If that's something you enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. Today we're starting a new series. We're going to talk about 10 underrated classic films. Let's get into it. The Girl Who Knew Too Much is notable for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, it was legendary Italian horror film director Mario Bava's last film shot in black and white. Secondly, it's known as the first giallo film ever made. It was Bava's least commercially successful film, and over time it's been overshadowed by the other work he did around the same time, the early 60s. There are also two versions of this film. American audiences might be more familiar with the more light-hearted cut of the film, which was released as Evil Eye. I vastly prefer the Italian version though, so that's the one I'll be referring to for the remainder of this segment. Between this film and Blood and Black Lace, Bava really laid the groundwork for the entire giallo movie genre. While Blood and Black Lace has the lavish setting, the black glove killer, and the colorful lighting, The Girl Who Knew Too Much taps into the Hitchcockian paranoia that would become a staple within the genre. Hell, even the title is obviously trying to evoke Hitchcock. That inspiration later trickled down to Dario Argento, who saw The Girl That Knew Too Much when he was still working as a film critic, and he really loved it. In terms of the story, The Girl Who Knew Too Much is actually really similar to Argento's early giallos, but it's a little easier to follow than his films. Like Argento's films, though, there are some fantastical elements here, but overall, I think the murder mystery here is really engaging, and it reaches a satisfying conclusion. And if you're not familiar with these types of films, that's actually way more rare than you'd think it'd be, especially since these stories are all murder mysteries. The story follows a woman visiting Rome who witnesses a murder on the Spanish Steps. She passes out after seeing it, and she wakes up, and after that, everyone around her is questioning if what she saw was actually real, so much so that she actually begins doubting herself. And since this is a giallo, she begins to investigate this mystery as well. These movies always have someone that's not the police doing their own investigation. The thing that sets this movie apart from every other giallo, though, is how classy the film feels. The exploitation and excessive violence that the genre would later be known for is missing here. The film takes a more muted approach to the material, and with the gorgeous black and white imagery, I think it works really well. Mario Bava was already an accomplished cinematographer and special effects artist at this point, mostly working with black and white films, so he was really firing on all cylinders here, using every bit of knowledge he had obtained in his long career. A young John Saxon plays the lead character's love interest, and from the sounds of it, he did not have an amazing time filming the movie. Because the movie was a commercial failure, he didn't actually see it until the 90s, and he was absolutely blown away by it. There's a lot to dig into here for those who are interested in the history of horror. Explaining what makes female prisoner Scorpion Jailhouse 41 so special in just a couple of minutes is going to be really difficult. It's an early 70s exploitation film from Japan that's part women in prison film, part revenge film, part road movie, and part art house. It's the second entry in a series of 4 films that are all loosely connected to each other, even though they all have the same main character, Nami Matsushima. She's played by Meiko Kaji, who is absolutely amazing in all 4 films. I think the first 3 are great for different reasons, and the 4th one I don't like as much. They brought in another different director for that one. So for now, let's just focus on this second entry in the series, Jailhouse 41. It is technically the most direct sequel in the series, since it picks up shortly after the conclusion of the first film, but you can also watch it as a standalone piece. Nami is once again imprisoned at the start of this movie. She's been betrayed by a corrupt cop, and she swears to take vengeance on him. Her plan is quickly derailed, however, when a riot sends her and a group of other prisoners to a harsh labor camp. Here, a dystopian nightmare begins, and the women realize that their only chance of survival is escaping. The beauty of this film is that it's kind of indescribable because there's nothing else quite like it. Yes, it's about a prison escape, but it's also about what it truly means to be free. It's about a tortured woman rising up and leading a rebellion against the status quo. It's reflecting on the horrors of World War II and how authority shouldn't always be looked up to. The first film in this franchise is a very well-made, small-scale revenge film, but with the sequel, they really expanded the scope of the entire story and improved on it in every single way. I haven't even mentioned how beautiful this film is. Nami is a very quiet character, so as she leads this rebellion of women, she gains almost mythical qualities, and this is reflected stylistically as well. The film starts as a women in prison film, and by the end, it almost becomes ethereal. So many of these shots feel like they could have been illustrations in an old storybook that mythologizes the life of a legendary warrior. This is of course still an exploitation film, so there's a lot of disturbing content here. It has that 70s sleaze to it, so I know that it's not going to be for everyone, but if you have any form of appreciation for these types of films, this is one you have to see. Demon Seed is a 1977 sci-fi horror movie that was rejected by both critics and audiences at the time. I don't think the marketing for this film did it any favors, since they made it look like a gratuitous, erotic exploitation film, and that's not quite what it is. The film is based off of a Dean Koontz novel with the same name about an AI gone rogue. The film's retro-future aesthetic feels Cronenbergian at times, and that's the best part of the movie to me. The story follows a couple on the verge of separation. The husband is a scientist who has created an AI that controls everything in their home. They are basically living in a smart home, and it's kind of wild considering how old this movie is. Since their marriage is practically in shambles, the husband pieces the fuck out in the beginning of this movie, and after that the wife is left alone as the AI hatches a truly sinister plan. The wife is named Susan and is played by Julie Christie, who you might have also seen in Don't Look Now. She brings some much needed prestige to this role, as the film could have easily felt silly without it. What I think has aged so well about this film is that it's about the way technology will inherit the flaws and biases of its creator. The AI in this film, named Proteus, becomes obsessed with reproduction and sees Susan as something to conquer, a means to an end. This is one of those films that sounds like it shouldn't work on paper, but it really does. It's actually really disturbing. It starts going in some silly directions in the third act, if I'm completely honest, but I do think they bring it back around for the ending. The last couple of moments in this film are actually very haunting and kind of fucked up. Like, I don't like to think about it for a very long time because it kind of freaks me out. There are some very big plot points here that I've deliberately talked around, and they give the movie some emotional weight. Basically, I went in expecting a goofy sci-fi 70s movie, and I came out of it kind of heartbroken. I think the journey these characters go on is quite touching. God Told Me To is directed by Larry Cohen, whose name you might know from movies like It's Alive, The Stuff, and Q the Winged Serpent. The film starts as a gritty 70s crime thriller set in New York, and honestly sets up quite a compelling mystery. Random murders are happening in the city. Seemingly normal, well-adjusted people are committing these crimes, and the only motive they are able to give is that God told them to. Because this is a Larry Cohen film, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that it gets pretty wild, but I don't want to give away anything more than that. I think the genre blending here between this gritty investigative thriller and whatever the fuck this movie turns into is super charming, and that's not me being coy about what happens in the film. I legitimately don't know how to label it. I mean, there's obviously some mass delusion going on, and there's a fair bit of cosmic horror in the film as well. It's wild, as I said, but they play it pretty straight, which is a really good call, because the acting is so good in the film. Larry Cohen's guerrilla filmmaking also adds a layer of realism to the film that makes it feel pretty grounded. I understand that films like The Stuff and It's Alive are more iconic, but God Told Me To is my favorite Larry Cohen film, and I think it's very underseen. Targets is from 1968 and stars Boris Karloff as an aging horror actor getting ready ready for one final public appearance. His story intersects with that of a lone gunman running rampant on the streets of Los Angeles. This might be more of a really violent crime thriller, but because it stars Boris Karloff in a role that's very inspired by himself, I think this will appeal to a lot of horror fans. Karloff really shines in this role, and it makes you wonder what his career could have been if he had landed more speaking roles. Essentially, this is a film about the changing of the times, both in cinema and in life for the average American. It tells these two stories simultaneously to great effect. The film is directed by Peter Bogdanovich, who would later be acclaimed for his slice of life films like The Last Picture Show. Targets does feel different in that film, but there's quite an interesting parallel between the two because they both feel very hopeless, but Targets isn't completely devoid of fun either. I mean, this is a film where Boris Karloff stars as a character named Byron Orlock. It's pretty tongue-in-cheek. Obviously, the film is pretty grim since it depicts random, seemingly senseless gun violence in a very matter-of-fact way, but I think that showing that on screen in this very horrifying way feels more relevant now than ever. There's an interesting blending of genres here, and Karloff's performance really makes it worth watching. The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane is a compelling little mystery film from the 1970s starring a very young Jodie Foster. She actually has the lead role here as a Pippi Longstocking type of character. The film is basically set up like a play, all taking place in this one house where she lives with her father, or at least she says she does, but her father is never around. People come to the house asking for her parents, and they're never allowed to see them. People begin to notice, and that's where the trouble starts. The film gets pretty uncomfortable because most of it is about a young girl in a very vulnerable position talking to strange men. I don't know how else to put it. Martin Sheen has a pretty big role in the film, and he's unsettling, to say the least. And I guess unsettling is a good word to describe the whole picture. There's definitely some choices here that are baffling by today's standards. Those choices don't ruin the film, but they're definitely going to stand out for modern audiences. This is not me trying to say that the film is problematic. I mean, I just recommended a women in prison film to you guys. I just think our vocabulary has grown when it comes to uncomfortable topics like these. But I don't want that to be the only thing you take away from this recommendation. The mystery in this film is really engaging and kept me on the edge of my seat. It's a very dialogue-heavy film, and the dialogue is very sharp. Jodie Foster's character consistently outsmarts the grown-ups coming to her house, but she does so with a childlike glee. She's really capable, but she also overestimates her own abilities a little bit, and that's a really fun quality for your main character to have in a suspense thriller like this. You're never quite sure if she's actually going to be able to get out of these situations. Long Weekend is a 1978 Australian film about a couple who goes on a camping trip and end up having to fight the nature around them. I've seen plenty of animal attack films, but I can't think of too many films like this where the environment as a whole feels like it's being controlled by some malevolent force, hellbent on fucking over the main characters. The environmentalist message of this movie is very hard to miss, since the couple are very disrespectful to the nature and wildlife around them. It's a pretty straightforward premise, but there's a lot to unpack and read into. The couple's relationship is not very good, and it definitely feels like them being around each other is only making them more miserable. They don't really have any empathy towards each other, their friends, or their surroundings, and that can be annoying to watch, but it also makes sense because they're so tired of each other. Obviously, the solution here is for them to split up, but that's easier said than done, especially from an outside perspective. It's also just really entertaining to see some terrible people get their comeuppance in this way. I mean, they have to fight both the weather and various wild animals throughout this movie, and they're at such a clear disadvantage out in the wilderness. But it doesn't really feel schlocky either. I think the film could have felt a little too absurd in the hands of less capable filmmakers. Twins of Evil is a Hammer horror film from the early 70s, which was around the time when Hammer was really trying to reinvent itself. They started moving away from their classic monster films to more violent and provocative cinema. The quality of the studio's films in the 70s was very hit or miss, but Twins of Evil is legitimately a really great film. It's kind of schlocky, but not nearly as gratuitous as the premise will have you believe it is. The film is basically a mix of different ideas that Hammer had used before in their films. Peter Cushing plays this ruthless witch hunter who is in a power struggle with the count of this huge castle that lies just beyond the village that most of the movie takes place in. The title refers to the twin sisters that arrive in the village at the start of the film, and they become corrupted by the count's influence. They are played by real-life twin sisters and Playboy models Madeline and Mary Collinson. It's pretty clear that Hammer set out to make a sexploitation vampire film, but it still feels pretty classy. The cast is really good, and since it was the director's first film with Hammer, he really wanted to do a good job. This was around the time when Hammer was actively looking for new talent to bring in-house, so the people making this movie took it super seriously, hoping that it would lead them to more jobs. That makes the film straddle this really fine line between absolute schlock and classic gothic horror. There's also not really a morally good protagonist in the film, which makes it really interesting. The titular Twins of Evil are actually the least evil characters in the story, since they are under the influence of a greater force. This is one of my favorite Hammer horror films, for sure. Messiah of Evil is a Lovecraftian take on Night of the Living Dead. It's also reminiscent of Carnival of Souls due to the film's dreamlike quality. It's from the early 70s, but it hasn't been considered a must-see classic up until the last couple of years or so. I watched this movie for free on YouTube like 2 years ago, and you can probably find it somewhere on this platform. It's an eerie little film because of how strange everything feels in it. It's about a woman who travels to a sleepy seaside town to visit her father. Her father is an artist, and once she gets to his studio, she realizes that he is nowhere to be found. In fact, most of the people in this town seems to be missing, as the streets are completely empty. At night, however, a zombie-like horde emerges from the shadows. The horde seems to operate with some sort of hive mind, so it's up to the main character to find out what happened to her father while avoiding these zombies. But honestly, as soon as she arrives in the town, the plot kind of takes a back seat. If you've seen any of my prior videos, you'll probably know that I really like vibe-heavy films, and this is definitely one of those. Every shot in this thing is gorgeous, even though the film was made on a very small budget. It's definitely one of the best film discoveries I've made in the last couple of years. Race with the Devil is one of my favorite horror films of all time. I'm not saying that to overhype the movie. In fact, it's very important for me to set the right expectations with my recommendations. So I'll just say this. I love stories about satanic cults, I love road movies with crazy car chases, and I love slow burn horror. This movie has all of those things. It's like it was tailor-made for me. That's not me saying that this is a perfect film. It's about two couples, and the women in the film barely have anything to do. It was made on a tight budget with no room for reshoots, so certain segments of the film feels very cobbled together, because that's literally what happened. But it's also really cool, so I don't know if I care about any of that. It's about these two couples that are on their way to a ski vacation in Aspen, Colorado. They're in an RV, and one night while resting in a desolate park, the husbands witness a ritualistic murder. They are spotted by this group of people who begin chasing after them, and the rest of the movie goes from there. The two husbands are played by Peter Fonda and Warren Oates, who already knew each other very well and had worked together before. Their chemistry is one of the best things about the movie, as they would mold these characters after themselves, often changing lines in the script to make it feel more natural to them. But this isn't just a road movie filled with car chases. In fact, I think the budget was much too small to have that much action in the film. Instead, there are lots of quieter moments of uneasiness, as the characters have to look over their shoulder every time they stop. And they have to stop. They have to go to the police because they just witnessed a murder. A simple scene of them stopping for gas is filled with so much tension because the cultists could be anywhere. And as I mentioned before, the film is a slow burn, so it isn't until the third act where things really pop off. And the way that these cultists just keep on coming at the protagonist like zombies on motorcycles and pickups is honestly kind of unhinged, but it works in the context of the film. If such an explosive action scene would have happened at the beginning of the film, I think I would have found it pretty ridiculous, but here it works because they spend such a long time working up to it. Just to be clear, just because this is one of my favorite horror movies doesn't mean you will love it as much as me, but if you decide to give it a go, I can pretty much guarantee that you are going to have a good time. It's fairly creepy at times, and it's technically a very well-made movie, so the action is very entertaining. Alright, those were all the films I had for this first entry into this series where we delve into classic horror and exploitation films. I wanted to throw exploitation films in here as well because I have a lot of those sort of hidden gem films that fall into exploitation. I think it connects very heavily with horror, so it works in the context of the show. Please comment, like, subscribe if you enjoy this type of content recommendations. I am trying to focus on this channel and really get a lot of good stuff out there, so I appreciate it. As I said before, like over 1,000 subscribers, that's incredible. I am really thankful, and yeah, I hope you all are well. I'll talk to you guys next time. Okay, bye.